All right. So with that, let's dive into our first episode. In this first episode, we'd love to cover a high-level overview of what a portfolio is, what they're used for, and perhaps a little more personally, like our own history with them and how we interacted with them. From there, we'll dig into the nuance of a few key definitions of what we mean by portfolios. There's some elements of this that I think are pretty important to set the stage for understanding the overall arc and everything we're about to do. And then we'll wrap this episode with a deep dive into a handful of the tensions and trade offs and kind of definitional pieces that just keep coming up over and over again. Some of the themes that, if you ignore around portfolios, we just won't get anywhere. As we go through this, I know many of our listeners are coming from a safe background. Some of you will have just attended the SAFE Summit at the time you're listening to this. And we wanted to be very clear on how we are relating to the explicit content of the SAFE framework in this entire podcast arc. Um, our mindset on this is that we're going to be anchored in that. It is a familiar common language. It is something we both understand and speak very fluently. And more importantly, it's something that many of you listening to this will be familiar with. And if not, you're able to just go to the framework homepage and look it up and understand the language we're using. But we're not going to be constrained by it. A lot of what we have to share and a lot of our perspectives are kind of forged in the fires of practice. And they're things that we have learned with various degrees of scars along the way. And to try to force everything back into the language of the framework isn't necessarily helpful. So we're not going to be constrained by that language, but where appropriate, we'll reference to it, we'll connect to it, and make sure that it's clear where we are. Once in a rare while, we might get a little persnippety and decide to disagree with the framework at times, but we try to hold each other accountable and be very explicit and clear when we do disagree. So that if we're saying something that is against the written practice for whatever reason, whether it's a contextual situation or a more general personal preference, we want to be very clear with that so that, frankly, you know what decisions you're making based on what we're saying. So, based on that, I think it's an interesting place to start just to understand our first encounters with portfolios. I think everybody comes into the world of portfolio a little differently. And I think it would help to know where we are coming from. Mark, do you want to get started with that?
So I guess for me, I was a developer for a long time. Right? I was a dev, I was an architect, I was a development consultant for better than 15 years. And it was in the kind of later phase of that development that I encountered agility. And portfolio was something that had never interested me as a developer. I had a very developer centric view of the world. And it was like, portfolios are these things that exist to slow us down. And that was my starting
Yeah.
perspective. And really, my introduction to portfolio came along with when I started to lean into scaling agility and, of course, safe as part of that. And I still had this very, very development team centric view. I was interested in safe to get to team of teams or program level, as we used to call it, because it was like, well, there's problems we can't solve at a team level. We need something at a higher level to solve those problems and a broader system perspective. And so when you started to think about an art, it was like, we've got a vehicle here where we can see patterns of problems and we can make more holistic trade offs at a level of scale out. And, I looked at, my early versions of Safe. And of course, the portfolio was the thing you went to when it was outside the boundaries of the train. So I was still looking out at the world, or actually, to be honest, looking up at the world. And, what did I realize as soon as I started to think about, the problems we could solve at an art level was there are a whole bunch of problems we couldn't solve at an art level. What was slowing us down? What was making us inefficient? Why was life hard? How do we solve those problems? How do we bridge the gap from our agile world to the waterfall world that we're surrounded by? And I was like, well, portfolio is the answer to that. And, the early versions of Safe, there was this concept that said you probably had a portfolio of portfolios.
Hmm.
Um, and that it could be infinitely fractal because that used to be the buzzword. And so we began by, well, there's a portfolio that is fundamentally the business unit, or it was a center of excellence in that case, that contained our train. And we went, well, let's go up there and we can start to solve some of the problems that are hurting our train. But at the same time, I got a chance to do a little bit of work with a strategic portfolio, which was not necessarily following the safe portfolio guidance, but it was applying some of the safe portfolio
Hmm.
concepts. And that then started to go, oh, it's interesting things when you start to step out at that scale, and it asks you new questions. So they were specifically applying concepts like strategic themes, wisdom, capacity allocation at a portfolio level. And they ran an exercise where they compared their strategic intent and their intended allocation with their committed intent. And there was a very strong mismatch. And it prompted this question that says, well, we can't afford our strategy. So either we've got to change our commitments or change our strategy. It's like, oh, this starts to get powerful. And, the longer I've played in scaling, the more that I've recognized that ability to ask yourself big strategic questions and recognize where your actual real inflection points matter. And so over time, I've really landed this. I think the easiest way to describe it is what happens when I work with companies, small companies using Safe. And small companies is like, you know, effectively the whole company's a train.
Hmm.
But what happens when you do that is you go to PR planning, you go to management review, and your trade-off decisions where your priorities conflict is like, what does this mean for our business strategy? What have we
Right.
told our shareholders? What have we told our key customers? And we choose A instead of B. What's that really doing in terms of our company strategy? It's like that's a super powerful discussion. And so I kind of got to this point of going, it's convenient, small company, train equals company. You get the true strategy discussions, right? And every discussion
Mhm.
you have is really fundamentally a business strategy discussion. And I think portfolio is the vehicle that helps you achieve that in enterprise. So I went from really thinking of portfolio as an annoyance outside my world to thinking of portfolio as the place where true strategic inflection points can be achieved. What about you, Eric?
Interesting that you have that connection in the small companies where you can just see and really feel the responsiveness of the system because of that connection, and then try to take it into the enterprise. My journey was kind of similar in some ways in that I was a developer. I didn't think of portfolio as anything. It was kind of not relevant. I was For the first 7 years of my career, I worked for a product or a contracting company that mostly did outsourced project development. So like we were so disconnected from even the idea that there was a portfolio in our clients. We were 100% focused on how does our software solve their problems. And I made this huge jump from there to two little startups where our product was the business. And maybe the second one of those Incubook is where I started to get the glimmer that there was a bigger something outside, because we were embedded in a larger company. We were part of one of their incubators. And I periodically worked with their IT, and I would call into their API to send things out to their printers. And it's like, oh, there's a bigger world out there that's relevant to me. But it was like, okay, relevant for credit card processing, relevant for shipping things to the printer, relevant for these very narrow contextual. And my ecosystem awareness of that was I'm writing code that calls into something else, and that something else happens to be owned by the same company. Like that was my developer and even beginning like application architect view into the larger portfolio. And I've spent more time on the architecture side of that. So it was still solving problems, but as I got into more interesting problems for larger and arguably more interesting companies, I had to be much more aware of what else was in that ecosystem around me, what the opportunities were, um, what other systems were going to constrain or duplicate or store on the same platform back when we actually had actual servers. In one instance, who else in the portfolio was I stealing the raised floor space from because our app was more important than their app? And they shut theirs down and kept ours running. And it's like those sort of things started to become relevant as an architect. And the more I pursued that, the more I became very aware of the application and enterprise solution portfolio. But the financial side of it was still somewhat not relevant. I was a contractor at heart. I was being placed, and therefore all the budgetary things were sorted out by the time I walked through the door. And if there was a problem with it, I wasn't around to solve it because I would be walked out the door because they were out of money.
Yeah.
So the whole financial dynamic and the strategic elements of the portfolio was not relevant to me at that time. It was all about solving problems. But then I became a coach, and then I started working on solving teams problems, and that was where I had a similar journey of, okay, these problems can't be solved by our small teams. Let's work the next level up, and I'll work with the directors and the leaders to make the team's problems go away. And I wasn't really thinking team of teams here. This was well before SAFe, although it was in an environment that would have many teams. Um, and then I would start to recognize that that director level is actually just as constrained, and I would start to work with the VPs. And I very much encountered the portfolio as a result of coaching VP to low C level executives, where I realized that if we're going to solve problems, we had to look at all the problems that were trying to be solved. And oh, there's a way there's money assigned to those, and there's a way that we make priorities and trade offs. And that was kind of my view into portfolio management was choosing what problems to solve and which ones we're going to spend our money on because we don't have enough of it. So then I started digging into that and learned the world of finance and learned the world of company level economics and how it influenced, and started to figure out more about how companies interact with the street and how that happens and the strategy elements there. And all of that was the framing that I had when I started to really dig into portfolios in a safe environment. So I very much take a company level view and a application and platform and solution level view at portfolios. The whole financial trade-offs and games and all that actually came later for me. And it was really as a transformation leader, I had to start dealing with that element of it as as a primary concern as opposed to a secondary concern.
It's just listening to you, particularly that last couple of minutes. I think one of the things that really stood out for me was I had to learn a whole new language. Right?
Absolutely.
As an agile coach, right? I was what's the language of software development? And so many of the agile concepts really sit in that world of software development, or a little bit of
Mhm.
tweaking, a little bit more than software development, and then you get into these discussions, and it's like, well, what's the world of finance and capex and opex, and because you've got to learn the language of the people in the portfolio space to be able to have a meaningful discussion with them.
Yeah.
And I'd certainly been quite interested in lean and leveraged a lot of lean thinking in my kind of team level agile space, but I quickly found when I delved into portfolio, I really stopped talking about agile as lean, right? And
Mm.
economics, trade offs, and decision making.
Yep.
Yeah.
The software development coaches spending all their time talking about money and
Yeah.
policy. Fascinating. The I think that's actually a good segue. And as we talk about those different languages, is moving into asking what's in a portfolio, because the nature of what's being managed, I think, is a lot of what drives that language, and is sometimes a lot of the reason why when we first encounter executives, it does feel like a foreign language. It's just something else entirely. And I'm curious where your history is, because I've seen portfolios defined a few different ways. There's the obvious ones, a financial portfolio. Where are we spending our money? And that's a very small jump from there to a project portfolio. We're going to spend our money on X. We've got a pile of money, split it into all these little buckets. This bucket's for this bucket's for this, and those buckets represent projects, and you assign people to them and go. And I think anybody who's been working in agility for more than 5 or 7 years probably grew up in that world of we're trying to do something against this backdrop of project management as the next thing out from the team. But we also now with SAFe, we have arguably buckets of strategy, and the portfolio is a collection of strategies, or maybe a collection of people slash teams slash arts, like a human portfolio mixed with strategy. And then I described a little bit where I came from. It was a technology portfolio, application portfolio, and assets were my primary view into it at first. So, how do you think about all this?
I've learned that portfolio is a very overloaded word.
That's the given, yes.
That would be the given, right? And if I went, what was my first portfolio experience? It was a portfolio which was a collection of work, right?
Hmm.
And it was a center of excellence, and work came into the center of excellence, and we really used the portfolio thinking to start to apply some games with demand, um, dealing with demand, front doors, sort of systems thinking over the demand that came in, and sort of moving from a project based view to a set based view on the work that was coming through. But then I flipped to the strategy portfolio and it was all money,
Hmm.
right? It literally was money, 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 because it was the beast that drove a $300 million a year capex investment portfolio.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, that's a completely different view. And, Safe had talked about portfolio flow and Epic Kanban, and I think we probably had one of the first published Epic Kanbans that we used to start to think about flow of bigger pieces of work. But it also talked about strategic themes and allocation and investment horizons, which was more how did you frame your strategy? And as soon as we started talking about framing strategy, it was just money. Um,
Hmm.
and to be honest, that was kind of the view. And I started to go, actually, a real portfolio is it's a material amount of money. And then I started talking to other clients, and people would introduce themselves as a portfolio manager, and I had this really common piece, which was someone would talk to me about being a portfolio manager, and I'd say, "Well, what's your portfolio?" They'd show me, and it'd be like a small collection of projects that really was an art. And as often as
Hmm.
not, we would find something that was conceived of as a portfolio, and it'd be like, "Here's some work and some money to fund the work." Um, and well, let's create an art that gives you some guaranteed capacity to execute on the work. And let's start to think about it as a collection of work rather than a collection of individual pieces. So, is there a typical answer? No. Uh,
Hmm.
is there a truth? I got money, I got work, I got people. And it'll be some combination of those three things in the eye of the beholder.
Do you see there's a progression? There's not a single answer, but is there a typical progression you see companies go through?
I don't know that it's so much of a progression as you'll see all different combinations and permutations in different parts of the company.
Yeah.
And quite often, what's missing is a coherent connection between them. And, you know, the first thing I learn't the naive coach way was don't tell somebody their portfolio is not a portfolio. That's not a fun conversation. Um,
Oh, doesn't end well either.
but it was, whatever notional portfolio you're working with, it's go, well, what is it? And then what's relevant? Because, if it is just a collection of small projects, probably not relevant to start talking about strategic framing, right? And so a bit of it became for me a hunt for going, if an organization's at the point of starting to say, well, let's think about lean portfolio management, it's like, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And are we looking at the right portfolio to
Hmm.
solve that problem? And then is there a moment in time where we start to grow the emphasis of some portfolios and perhaps shrink the emphasis of others and put them in context? Um, the one of the biggest pieces of portfolio work I did. I walked in on day one. They said these are our portfolios. I went, no, they're not portfolios. Um, and they were fiefdoms. And I was like, well, actually, we can't kill the fiefdoms, but we can create a lot more emphasis on a broader strategic portfolio that we existed really to just provide governance over the collection of fiefdoms, to start to say, actually,
Yep.
we want to lift the conversation here and recognise where the right responsibilities sit. What about you?
Well, you've hit on a progression that actually is a little bit of a common one, I think, and it's the same way we way back and still occasionally today see the need to make that progression from functional groups to cross-functional teams. I actually kind of like the term cross fiefdom portfolios. Like there's a element of this that a important piece is to take smaller things and create a connection layer and a steering layer across them. And I have the same experience going in where somebody says we want to do LPM, and that's like hearing I want to do Agile. I want to do story points. Well, okay, let's step back. What problem are you trying to solve? And I used to, and this is a couple of the really interesting failures and flat on my face moments were when I tried to convince them they were solving the wrong problem, which is like telling them it's not a portfolio.
Yeah,
um, but I realized over time, and especially now, that if they're looking at, say, portfolio as a container for projects, the things we do to help are going to be different than if they see portfolio as a collection of solutions. And that seems to me, with my value system, like a healthier starting point. You're managing these assets as assets. You're investing in capex and opex together for those assets. You're not splitting to your old application management group and your cool new things group.
yeah,
Um, but then we also see in LPM this huge opportunity to move to a container for strategy
yeah.
and a way to deploy strategy and deploy purpose as the thing that anchors your portfolio. And wow, do I want to help people jump there from wherever they are. Let's just jump straight there and get moving. And that's what's exciting and it's fun for me as a coach. But it's not where they're at and it's not what they want to do.
No, and
Um, so,
it sorry, go on.
no, carry on.
I was just going to riff on that because it's probably the biggest pattern that I see out there in the world of safe is, you know, they literally create portfolios to solve some problems achieved by a collection of arts.
Hmm.
And whether it's that the arts are designed in such a fashion that the arts can't actually deliver value independently, and they need a portfolio wrapper to be able to have a value discussion, or they need some layer of translation between the existing enterprise ecosystem and the language it talks and what goes in the PPM system and the work that's happening in their agile world. Um, so it's like a translation layer,
Hmm.
um, or an invented coordination vehicle. And
Yeah.
it probably comes back to what can you see? A little bit like my world as a dev. What could I see? I could see the thing that caused me problems at the next layer out. Um,
Yeah. And just because we happen to have jumped off that cliff before and know what's at the bottom doesn't mean they do.
yeah,
And I think the other thing that's important to pay attention to as you're going through these is being aware of kind of the not just the contents of the portfolio, but kind of the how far towards the customer is the portfolio. Sometimes people say portfolio and they really just mean IT portfolio, literally just the technology projects.
yeah,
Sometimes they say portfolio and they actually mean all the things that the business is delivering as products, and the technology is an afterthought in some ways.
yeah,
Like, of course, we have some tech down there, but my portfolio is the 27 different cancer medicines that I sell or whatever.
yeah,
And they forget that portfolio is a word for technology stuff too.
yeah,
And then once in a while, you get those rare companies that are actually treating the portfolio as a blended thing and having joint conversations already. And if you go in with basic practices in those cases, you kind of get pushed out of the room for taking them backwards.
yeah.
So being aware of that dynamic starts to get really interesting.
So,
So
so if we took this notion, and uh, I love hearing the fact that you've made some of the same mistakes I've made, is at the end of the day, when you walk into a portfolio conversation, you have a lens. Right? I hear
mhm.
the word portfolio, and it means X to me. And does it mean money? Does it mean work? Does it mean people? Does it mean technology? Does it mean product? Does it mean line of business? What what was kind of the, I guess for you, if you go, what was the dominant lens you began with? And what's your experience been with perhaps other people you've seen starting down this journey of kind of get more lean and agility in the world of portfolio management? What's the starting lens?
um, so I will say my default lens more often than not is still solution. And it used to be the technology solution. Now it's for me like the whole product, the business capability, including the ancillary stuff, not just the tech and the help and the deployment and the operations, but like that in the people in the call center and the frontline staff that are supporting things. And like it's kind of a whole product view of solution, but it's still the thing. The business capability is where I start from. And yet when I hear others talk, I've trained myself. I had to train myself to to assume their default lens was probably project first and work first,
Yeah.
just based on the generation of people that I supported in the portfolio. And I'm delighting in this, but as I start to work with kind of, let's say, up and coming coaches, people that are new in their careers and haven't really had to fight the pre-agile battles, and they're actually just fighting the battles of various flavors and approaches and qualities of agile. I'm starting to meet people that their default assumption of portfolio is actually people. And it might be a healthy form of like groups of scrum teams, groups of arts, what have you. Or it might be an unhealthy version of the portfolio that is everybody under John or Jill or Tanya or whoever in the leader centric portfolios. But I'm starting to see person portfolios, human portfolios as a default again, and it's kind of delightful. You?
Um, I think these days my default starting lens is actually strategy because my wiring is, the more I've worked with senior executives, the more I've worked with people who are incredibly frustrated because there's a world they want to create and a world they're stuck in, and they want to
Hmm.
help, but people can't point them towards the key interventions they could make. They literally drown in noise. So if I had a word that kind of summed up the first view I have of portfolio, it's spaghetti, right? and, and it's how do you make enough sense of the spaghetti that you're not caught in the weird and wonderful detail oriented twists and turns of it internally, and you can actually kind of zoom back out and have the conversations you really need to have that'll make a big difference. Um, and I guess the hard part of that learning lens is you can't necessarily rush to being able to do that, and that's what I've been
Yeah.
able to I've had to catch myself in is, you know if you try and rush too hard towards your first interpretation, you're in trouble. And
Yes.
it's the same as, first interpretation is people. If you live in the safe world, you innately think of a portfolio and people as being kind of stitched together because the portfolio funds a set of dedicated capacity to serve the portfolio strategy. And so the portfolio has
Mhm.
people. But then, to be honest, most strategic portfolios I see don't necessarily own people. They solve for the multiplexing of the way in which people are distributed and multiple portfolios compete for the same groups of people. Really common situation.
Yeah. So it's interesting that that you want to use then tend to use that strategy lens first. And I find I still hold strategy apart as something that acts on a portfolio as opposed to being in the portfolio. And I'm working on that decentralization. It's something I'm seeing more and more companies, especially the small ones, they're more one and the same. But I still struggle to conceptualize it as strategy in the portfolio by default. That's a little theoretical some of the time, even though I know it's better, except when it doesn't work for the company you're playing with.
I, I, I think my lens on that would be there's a lot of portfolios that don't have a strategic mandate,
Yeah.
right? And so if you mess around with strategy tools in a portfolio that doesn't have a strategic mandate, you're probably wasting your time. Um,
Yeah.
and that's many deep discussions in and of itself. Um, but because I'm looking for key inflection points in an organization's journey, strategy is where you make.
Yeah. So there's one other type of portfolio we didn't really address, and we kind of used portfolio as container as our metaphor for all the examples we provided. But there's one other that I do see that still astounds me whenever I see it, but it's held by a lot of operational leaders. Is it a portfolio is nothing more than a collection of governance processes,
Yeah,
and it's a thing like it's portfolio management without actually having a portfolio. So there's no conception of what's in or out. It's just this process layer that sits on top of everything. And that's a good one to I think to remember that some people hold that there is nothing in a portfolio. It is just a way of managing all the stuff.
yeah.
So you mentioned mandate a moment ago, and specifically a strategic mandate. I think that's a great segue to talking about the different kind of top level responsibilities and mandates that a portfolio has. And I think I was going to talk about this originally, but since you did the segue, perhaps you want to jump into this one.
I'll prime and then I'll throw back to you. Right. And
Yeah.
I think the easy starting point is SAFE presents a triangle of portfolio responsibilities, right?
Hmm.
Strategy, operations, governance.
Yep.
And for me, they're three very useful words because if I'm in any discussion in an organization about portfolio, those three words in some mix of prominence will appear in that discussion,
Yes.
right? Uh, Arguably, a lot of the time, governance is the word that's used first, and perhaps we talk about altering the prominence of those words. But that metaphor of going, okay, we've got these three things to care about is pretty useful. Now, jumping on record here, I've wrestled with perhaps the layer underneath SAFE in terms of what lives in SAFE inside those three triangles of strategy, operations, and
Hmm.
governance. And I had a period of my time where I just stopped using the three triangles because I had so much internal wrestle with the contents. But then I had a recognition, and I think, Eric, you helped me with that recognition that thinking strategy, operations, governance is a really powerful metaphor,
Hmm.
regardless of whether you necessarily agree with the fine print of SAFE's interpretation underneath. You want to take us a little bit deeper on that one?
Yeah, it's one that I've embraced them since I first saw them. But as we had that discussion you were referring to, I started to realize that I kind of just ignored what was inside the triangles. I mean, I could teach it, I could regurgitate it on demand. I would usually have a cheat sheet open when I did so, but I took them more at face value rather than content and detail value. And the core message, and this used to be a very strong lead in slide, and it's still in a number of different places, but where it was like strategy drives your operational approach, which in turn informs your governance approach. And please don't close the loop and let your governance constrain your strategy. And that slide, which had two out of the three, like two of the connections drawn and one very conspicuously not drawn, was to me the most powerful message of the entire portfolio level. Figure out what your strategy is, however you get there. And we'll come up in another one of these podcasts and talk about the different ways you get there. Use that to inform how you operate, which includes your reporting, your structure, all kinds of operational considerations. Because if you're fundamentally, if you're selling a product versus if you're delivering a library of IT support services, you have wildly different operational needs in the first place. and different parts of the company will have different operational needs. So that message lands pretty quickly when everybody's like, oh, yeah, my group's special. We're different than all the other groups. I'm like, yes, you actually are. You're one of a set of patterns, but you're different than your peers. And then use that. And this is where a lot of companies fall over, I think. Use that to inform the right way to apply the necessary governance. And governance is another one of those words like portfolio that means hundreds of different things to different people. And we'll dig into it later exactly what we mean. But some of that governance is absolutely crucial and can impact the ongoing existence of your company. Like if you don't respect in the US FDA regulations when you're doing medical devices, you will not have a company selling medical devices for very long. And that element of governance is the part that I really fixate on. I've done controlled environments for aviation, for medical devices, software that goes into the neonatal intensive care unit that is literally managing the lives of babies as small as my hand. Like, those are the things that I think of when I think of governance, is making sure that stuff is stable, healthy, and the service people and the children are alive at the end of the day. And then also, yes, there's large sums of money some of the software manages, and that's probably important too. It's kind of always been my view on this. But that lens is what's informed the necessary cascade. Do really good governance in service to how you need to operate, which is in turn in service to where you want the company to go. And that's the type of mandate I'm looking for. What do you want to say about mandates? How do you use the phrase a lot more than I do, and I think you use it well.
Look, I think, and maybe I'm going to start with, you had years of safely ignoring SAFE's definitions inside the three triangles. I had
Hmm.
years of arguing with SAFE's definitions. But at the end of the day, I think the first thing, and always coming back to with portfolio, it's you've got to start where you are.
Yeah.
And if you're going to start where you are, you've got to know where you are. And
Hmm.
the first thing I do is to say, it doesn't really matter what Eric's definition or my definition of or SAFE's definition of those three triangles is. You've got to know what your company's definition is and your context definition.
Hmm.
And then I think the second thing is you've got to go, for a given portfolio, what is the mandate it has in those space, right? Where does it have freedom to change? Where does it have freedom to drive? If your portfolio is, for example, a random collection of projects, uh, is strategy relevant to your portfolio? And we're going to dig into that a lot in some of our future episodes. But then there's another question that says, well, assuming strategy is relevant, and most of the time it should be relevant to a portfolio, is our portfolio, do we have the mandate to shape strategy? Or is our mandate to ensure that the strategy is fulfilled? Uh, where are our boundaries? What should our
Hmm.
emphasis be for this portfolio in this context, um, given the expectations placed on us? So,
Yep.
staying in another kind of overloaded term, operations is another beautiful one, because we've got portfolio operations and we've got business operations. And I remember when we first dug into the word operations as we were doing some prep for this series, we wound up in a very long distraction path. Um, so over to you, Eric. Let's talk
Well,
about.
that wasn't. Yeah, that was an interesting one for me because it was probably one of the better examples we have of when we talked past each other for an extended period without realizing it.
Yeah.
And you'll notice we're being pretty intentional using the language portfolio operations. And by that, we mean the mechanics of managing or operating the things in the portfolio, the orchestration of the portfolio, if you will. Because I used to draw a very strong difference between business strategy, which in my mind is what do you want to make different, and business operations, which is what is that list of things you want to keep doing reliably day after day after day. So, by that definition, connecting to safe for a moment, business operations is essentially keeping your operational value streams running, in my mind. And you will need to do some IT and development and software work to make that happen. There's stuff that has to go in there. But to me, that's not strategy. That's just ongoing carrying forward. And yet, Um, Business operations and continuity can be a strategy. And a number of us read Your Strategy Needs a Strategy lately. And in there, reading about the classical strategy and what it is to be a market leader with scale in a fairly stable market finally clicked with me that, oh, yeah, continuing to win where you're already winning by doing more of the same better, faster, and cheaper is an incredibly viable strategy. Just because I happen to have worked more with underdogs and up and coming product companies and companies that weren't in that position doesn't mean that those strategies are bad. Actually, it means they're winning until the market's disrupted out from under them. So it's important when you talk about operations, I think, to really be specific. Are you saying business operations, the running of the business, or are you saying portfolio operations, the orchestration of the portfolio and the developers and so on? Because those mean different things, but they can sound like the same thing, and you can have disastrous conversations, frankly, if you don't pay attention. The other thing that is my recent learning and something I think is quite valuable is strategic themes, that the reasons your portfolio exists can emerge from either. They can actually come from either of the sides and be relevant and important. It just changes the nature of what your OKRs look like. You can have operational improvement OKRs that are strategic in nature, or you can have change your business model and become a visionary company and do these big, crazy, awesome things that are equally valid and maybe a little more fun for me. But that doesn't diminish the importance and the relevancy of the other themes.
If I was going to add something on that, it would be also that there has to be a really strong connection,
Mhm.
right? Fundamentally, your strategy is going to influence your business operations. And whether it's influencing it in a steady state way or in a disruptive way, you got to link the two. And most meaningful portfolios, the correlation of the portfolio's impact is actually what it does in business operations. I had the
Mhm.
privilege to be working with or coaching a CFO who taught me, I think, far more than I taught her as we delved into this. And, we were looking at a portfolio, it was about $250 million, right? And
Mhm.
she kept saying, Mark, I got $2 billion worth of BAU in this space and $250 million worth of investment. And I'm actually much more interested in the $2 billion worth of BAU than the $250 million of investment.
Mhm.
And, the way that influenced the shaping of our portfolio articulation was huge.
I can
But
imagine. I mean, if you can get a 10% reduction in BAU costs, you just doubled the size of your investment portfolio
yeah,
or return a bunch of money to shareholders, depending on your corporate goals.
so if we move on, right, and we took a really interesting approach with this podcast because we draft recorded a bunch of sessions to go, let's figure out the stuff we agree on, violently disagree on, and find a path to being able to have a productive discussion within some kind of meaningful time box. And along the way through that, one of the things that happened was we each had stuff we cared passionately about, but then we found moments where we both went, "That's huge." And there were just some key concepts that came up again and again and again for us, whether we were talking about an individual portfolio or an ecosystem of portfolios in an enterprise. And I might throw to you, Eric, to just kind of get the ball rolling on your favorite
Yeah.
themes that came up for us.
Oh, favorite. Then that might even change our planned order of these then. Um, but it's important. It's interesting because it's almost like we did a word analysis of everything we said, and it's like these five things just kept coming up as relevant over and over again. And I think the two, and they're kind of related, so I might actually bring them together, is context and ecosystem. And we found ourselves as we talked about portfolios over and over, we could not talk about the portfolio without talking about the environment, the ecosystem within which it was operating, especially for the bigger companies with multiple portfolios. If you're product company, you've essentially got a few trains and all of it's in one logical portfolio. Your ecosystem is the environment your company lives in. But when you're a Fortune 50 company or global company at any scale, you've got multiple operating portfolios. You've got operating entities in a variety of different countries. You've got a lot of things going on to where anything one of your groups does, whether it's a single Scrum team or an entire person portfolio, hundreds to maybe thousands of people, they're operating within a sea, within an ecosystem around them. And the context, they're part of that ecosystem. Their neighborhood of what they immediately see defines a huge amount of what they actually need to do, what they need to change, what their growth opportunities are, how their strategy comes to life. Like it's almost to the point that we realize portfolios don't have meaning absent a deep understanding of the ecosystem and the context around them.
Yeah, it was and I think the other thing, just playing on the ecosystem world, was this idea of the inside and the outside of the portfolio.
Hmm.
And again, it's coming back to context and perhaps to edges. That the beginning wiring for a portfolio, and generally the first thing you'll teach if you're teaching portfolio management is, the portfolio provides context to those who serve it.
Hmm.
And, success for the portfolio is you can provide the context in a fashion that says the people working within the portfolio know why they're doing what they're doing and how it aligns to strategy. Um, but then that same thing is, back to the ecosystem. Well, the portfolio lives in an ecosystem. And if it doesn't understand its role in the ecosystem and doesn't understand the context that's provided to it by the broader ecosystem, it's got no chance whatsoever of doing it internally
Hmm.
in any kind of coherent way. And so, part of context, I think, there's an internal context you provide, there's a context you understand from those around you. Um, but there was also, edges, I think was your favorite word, Eric. So I'm going to throw back to you in a minute. But since we started using it so much, I've started using it a lot more anyway without you, right? You know, part of understanding the ecosystem and the context is know where your edges are and what sits on the edges. And we'll often say this for a train, right? What's going to bring a train unstuck most easily is the stuff just outside the edges of the train that are necessary to its mission.
Yep.
But, I'm new to edges being a favourite word. You've done entire conference presentations on it. Do you want to expand on edges a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot more there conceptually. I mean, you kind of nailed it. Know what is around you and know which ones you're likely to trip on. And the way I look at edges is by understanding those boundary conditions, understanding where the lines are between you and other, because they exist in enterprises. We could picture this wonderful flowy environment where there's no edges like that. But those boundaries exist all over the place in companies. And some of them are financial, some of them are human, some of them are hierarchical, some of them are technology based. They come from a number of different perspectives. And I talked about six of them in last year's US Summit talk. But fundamentally, these are the areas to look for risk. These are the places that your plan is going to fall over and you're going to have to dance the moment. But a lot of them are preventable with a little bit of forethought. You can invest in relationships to make them easier when things do get on, when the unexpected does happen. You can perhaps, if you have that mandate, start to tweak the edges a little bit to make them less troublesome. You can be intentional with them. The whole domain of team topologies and things like that is, to me, the the intentional definition of your edges, and using that as part of your way of thinking about teams and teams of teams. Um, the important thing, and maybe I'll use this as a segue and toss it back to you, is when thinking about edges, you have to be able to see them. You have to be able to know where they are and how what's on the other side of that edge connect itself connects to the larger ecosystem. So I'll toss our fourth favorite word back at you: visualization.
And most definitely, it's my favorite word. Um, I think if I started with visualization, I would go back to where I first began when I started to pretend I could be useful in the world of portfolio. And at that point, it was visualize flow, build Kanbans.
Hmm.
And it was the first step I'd take in any portfolio discussion would be to say, visualize your current flow or process. Usually it was visualize your process. How does work get done?
Yep.
How does it begin? What are the steps to the end? And then we'd literally take whatever it was. And usually that was an interesting discussion because somebody from the PMO would go, here's the process. And then half the other people in the room would go, and here are the ways we bypass the process. And these are the executive specials. Um, but then we turn that into a Kanban. We go, okay, well, let's put all the work that's going through the portfolio up. And now we can actually see the whole. And we can start to apply flow-based thinking to, you know, now we can see new things because we've visualized it in a way that's going to create a different conversation. And I think for a long time, I just fixated on the Kanban, the Kanban, the Kanban. To
Hmm.
be honest, the longer I've played properly with portfolio management, the less I've fixated on the portfolio Kanban. And the more I've fixated on what are the other visuals that create new conversations. Is it a
Hmm.
visual of your ecosystem? Is it a visual of the internals of the portfolio? Is it a visual of your balance of investment across the different areas of your strategy? How can you create a visual that supports a new conversation and fresh insights? Uh,
Yep.
would you add anything in the visualization
Um,
geekery front?
I would. I mean, I don't normally talk about this these days anymore, but I was an accredited Kanban trainer long before I found Scrum or Safe. And so that was my default view of the world was start where you are, visualize the system, make the policies explicit, and then simultaneously optimize within the bounds of what you have and start to change the system. And that was just my go-to approach and still is, frankly, from a change management point of view. But like you, what I visualize has shifted dramatically over time. When I first started being a tech lead, even before I was an architect, my go-to project management approach was to print out the architecture diagram at whatever level of abstraction is relevant, whether it was a database model, whether it was a enterprise architecture diagram. And for whatever problem somebody wanted to solve, we just started highlighting the things that would change. And there was my org map because somebody owned those things. It was my to-do list, and it was kind of the high-level spec of what the project management approach had to look like. And even when I was still bringing people to the work and doing essentially resource management type approaches, it still served me incredibly well to bring coherency and clarity to everybody. And it served its purpose as a visualization. As I started doing more explicit Kanban and started steering into multi level Kanban systems, it was great. I mean, I could visualize all the workflow. I could recognize that some of them were a little hairy and squirrely, and you might have some projects that flow through 7 states and some only do 3, and that's okay. And we'll have little jumps and the chutes and ladders on the board and whatever, but at least we could visualize it. And that broke down for me the moment that epics or whatever you were managing at the portfolio level stopped being buckets of work and started being things that did not have an actual end state and were based on metrics and achievement. And that's when it started to get interesting in the same way. And I changed my mindset towards what I was visualizing yet again in a big way.
So I'm going to take an opportunistic segue on that.
Okay.
One of the favorite visuals I've ever built in the world of portfolio was a visual of a portfolio investment spread, right? So it was
Yeah.
multi-$100 million portfolio and, it was funding a bunch of initiatives and it had a declared strategy
Hmm.
deck that was being communicated to the board. And we basically just built a pie graph to go, if these are all the initiatives in plan, what's their relative allocation as a percentage of the overall portfolio spend? And it was a beautiful pie graph because the first pie shape on it, or the first wedge, was 53% of the spend. Um, And then we had a whole bunch of pieces that were less than 1%. So you started with this massive wedge and then you wound up with invisible slices.
Hmm.
And then we put an overlay on that, which was, how do we correlate that back to the four things we've told the board we're focusing on, which created very, very fun conversations. But it also led to a phrase I've just used again and again and again since then, which is you've got to talk about apples and apples,
Yeah.
right? One of the things you need to do is to say, if I want to have some kind of meaningful strategic or system level conversation, I can't be talking about $150 million in one breath and $150,000 in the other breath, which
Right.
incidentally were the biggest and smallest wedges in this particular graph. Right? So this notion of starting to go understand materiality and start to think about how can I understand my portfolio and perhaps introduce different ways of understanding my portfolio or the ecosystem through the lens of having things with similar materiality present in the same discussion.
Materiality is an interesting word there, Mark. Is that one of our words by chance?
May be one of our words, right? It was the easy segue from the visual to the
Hmm.
materiality. And it's the number of times that materiality came up for us as we explored the many aspects of portfolio strategy, portfolio ecosystems, internal portfolio design. Um, it was, how do you recognize the materiality of the thing you're talking about and then create some way of creating discussions or insights
Hmm.
around things with similar materiality. And
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
And I think it's worth for this just giving a little brief definition of what we mean by materiality, because it's used very specifically, and we'll give a ton of examples in episode 3 of this arc. But just for purposes now, if you think about an overall set of business units in a company, um, and you've got this little tiny internal startup that's earning its first $100,000 in its first products, while you've got this $2 billion a year business behemoth that is paying all the bills. That's the kind of span where they have such different materialities, such different scopes of impact, that it's really hard to have people stay attentive on the tiny stuff. It gets lost. It's immaterial. It's rounding error, is what we mean by the nature of materiality. And then what Mark said, extending that into each of the layers, it starts to be like, okay, for a portfolio leadership team, all the things they're looking at on that epic Kanban board, if that's what they're managing at the moment, need to have similar brain share. And I did a similar visualization to you one time that was a slightly different purpose. I ask executives to rank in rough order how many hours per week they spent on and what their five like things they found themselves talking about were. And clearly those would be the most important was the assumption. And sure enough, they were the ones that aligned to the board. But then I did the same mapping of what was in the investment buckets. And like they didn't talk about an 85% of what was in the portfolio, but like most of their energy was on like 3% and another 10% got honorable mention. So that's the materiality conversation, is can you create the environment where the conversations are material to the trade-offs because things are similar, as opposed to trying to prioritize 3 epics, a feature, and 5 stories in the same conversation.
Which I've seen happen depressingly often.
I know that was a flashback moment. Sorry.
I felt it might have been. So we'll be talking about materiality an awful lot more. Actually, we'll be talking about all of our favorite words. So if there's a signpost here, it's context, edges, visualization, ecosystem, and materiality.
They
These
all lie
are
straight ahead.
the words we will come to again and again as we dig a little bit deeper. So if we kind of wrap up, this introductory episode, who are we? Where did we come from? Hopefully, you've got a little bit of a clue about that by now. Um, Different things you think about when you're looking at a portfolio, right? Firstly, be aware of the lens, your natural native bias, and your starting view. seek first to understand, and there are questions you start to ask yourself, right? Ask yourself questions around the nature of the portfolio, the mandate, the context, where it lives in the ecosystem, what its relationship is to the various pillars of strategy, portfolio operations, and governance. Um, and again, not what you think they are, but what the organization or perhaps different people in the organization think they are. And understand that the beginning of great portfolio management or heading down a lean portfolio management journey is understand where you are, right? Start
Mhm.
with some useful questions that help you paint a picture of today before you start trying to paint a picture of tomorrow. And next episode, we'll come back and we will be starting to talk about lean portfolio management, right? What are the jobs to be done of a portfolio and what makes a portfolio lean? And perhaps some of the things you might do a little bit more deeply as you understand where you are and begin to think about where you might want to go. So that is episode one as a wrap. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to speaking to you again when you come back for episode two.
Thank you.